Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk Cousins, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 quarterback rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be mentioning my top 16 ranked quarterbacks, of course, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions while presenting statistics in order to justify these current rankings. Now, a couple things to keep in mind. Every single statistic that I mention over the course of today's episode is for a 4-point per passing touchdown league. Additionally, all rankings that I mention are subject to change. As we progress closer to Sunday, there's going to be more injury information made public, which will help us make the most informed decisions for our Week 1 starting lineups. So, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on the latest rankings and information, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season for the singular purpose of trying to help you win a fantasy football championship. Additionally, besides the Sunday morning live stream that we'll be presenting from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time this upcoming Sunday, for those of you who are trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to travel down to the description of the video. Besides subscribing to the channel, check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you use code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, you'll get my rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18, sent from my email directly to yours, which will include by player, again, by position, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defense, flex included, half PPR and full PPR rankings. All of that for the singular purpose of trying to help you win a fantasy football championship throughout the 2023 season. So take advantage of the opportunity by signing up, using code Andrew, making that first-time deposit. You'll also get a first-time deposit match up to $100, so you can take advantage of the pick'em slip for Patrick Mahomes' 0.5 total yards for Thursday night's kickoff of the NFL season. So take advantage of the opportunity. For those of you who are wondering if you're eligible, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen. Your location will determine your eligibility. For those of you who have already signed up via Underdog Fantasy, whether it's code Andrew or another code in seasons past, or perhaps are not eligible based on your location, you can also check out the Patreon, link down in the description. Thank you very much for the support. All right, let's get into talking about my Week 1 quarterback rankings, beginning with Jalen Hurts as our number 1. Jalen Hurts takes on the New England Patriots, Bill Belichick's defense. But the fact of the matter is, the Philadelphia Eagles are on a revenge tour. After losing the Super Bowl, they're going to take out all that frustration on the New England Patriots defense. Last season, amongst all quarterbacks from weeks 1 through 15, Jalen Hurts was the number 1 quarterback in fantasy football, averaging 26.4 fantasy points per game prior to his injury. A full healthy Jalen Hurts is going to do a lot of damage. And especially considering this is a game in which the Philadelphia Eagles are only minus 3.5 point favorites, that's quite a surprise. I expect this to be a one-sided affair, but if they can keep it close, the New England Patriots could absolutely allow Jalen Hurts to keep himself in the game longer, not running out the clock in the second half, and of course, throwing the ball, finding himself more fantasy upside. Specifically last season in 2022, in games in which, of course, this team was dominating in the first half and had to run out the clock in the second half, it forced Jalen Hurts to be very limited in the passing game in the second half. So in fact, amongst all quarterbacks last season, he was number 8 in terms of total passing attempts in the first half and number 24 amongst all quarterbacks in terms of passing attempts in the second half. So that in itself kind of gives you an understanding as to how much this team began to rely upon the running game in the second half of games. Now, going into this week, the Eagles' backfield is still in flux. The official depth chart for the Philadelphia Eagles on their website has all 4, Kenneth Gainwell, DeAndre Swift, Rashad Penny, and Boston Scott as the starting first-string running back of the team. So if they're going to use a running back by committee, honestly, it's only going to help Jalen Hurts considering how much of a threat he is down in the red zone. Last season, amongst all players in the National Football League, number 2 in rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. Additionally, was number 3 in terms of touchdowns inside the 5-yard line in terms of rushing. We know he's going to absolutely dominate. That's why he's our number 1 quarterback going into the week. Moving on, let's talk about Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson with a new offensive coordinator, going from Greg Roman, the run-first approach, to Todd Monken, which we're expecting to see a lot more passing within this offense, bringing in guys like Odell Beckham Jr., Zay Flowers. There is going to be a conscious effort from this offense to allow Lamar Jackson to sit in the pocket and let it rip. And if that's going to be the case, especially considering the Baltimore Ravens are minus 10 favorites, they are 10-point favorites going into this matchup against the Houston Texans. If in fact we're going to see a blowout of sorts, that means that Lamar Jackson should be able to score early and often. And when he does, yes, he may slow down in the second half, but he'll have put up enough fantasy points from his initial contribution in the first 3 quarters, I would say, to be relevant for fantasy purposes and in this S tier. Additionally, with Mark Andrews being questionable all week, we've gone ahead and put all those overall, questionable tags to rest. He's going to be healthy. He's going to practice for the entirety of the week, and he'll be good to go for Sunday. Now, last season, amongst all teams in the National Football League, the Houston Texans allowed the second fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. The primary reason that was the case is because, again, they were getting blown out in the first half, and teams were running the ball in the second half. There's a reason why the Houston Texans allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics. on a per game basis. Therefore, we're anticipating, again, the Houston Texans defense to be improved with a new head coach, with a new coaching staff, new players, new personnel. That's going to be great. But Lamar Jackson coming into town, I'm hoping he's going to pour it on and score a bunch of fantasy points. Moving on, let's go ahead and mention the 1.01 brand. Again, if you guys have not yet already, travel down to the description of the video. Check out AndrewKirchhoffShop.com. Again, the 1.01 brand is the official merchandise line of the Andrew Kirchhoff YouTube channel. Excited to create this offseason, present it to you guys. So if you're interested in getting yourself high quality, stylish, comfortable clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays, be sure to go ahead, support the channel, rep greetings and salutations. Check out the website today. 1.01 brand is now available. Thank you very much. I appreciate the support. All right, let's get into talking about our number 3, Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes only sits in the A tier because of my assumption that Travis Kelce is not going to be playing on Thursday. And if that's going to be the case, we don't know exactly what the impact is going to look like because we've never seen Patrick Mahomes play without Travis Kelce. Travis Kelce hasn't missed a game due to injury since 2013. Just put that into perspective. Now, when we talk about what Patrick Mahomes is capable of, last season, when you took away Tyreek Hill, his overall contribution and production did not dip, and in fact got better. Last season, averaging 309 passing yards, 2.4 passing touchdowns, and 24.49 fantasy points per game. So there is a possibility that even in the absence of Travis Kelce not being in the lineup, he's going to continue to be as good as he's always been. Again, the only reason he's in the A tier is primarily because if I'm comparing him with someone like Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, I'd rather play those two other quarterbacks based on the fact that Travis Kelce is not going to be active. But with that all being the case, we all know that Patrick Mahomes in September is a different quarterback, especially week 1. Throughout his career from 2018 through 2022, Patrick Mahomes in week 1 games averages 308 passing yards, 3.6 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions, and 28.86 fantasy points per game. Andy Reid gets these men prepared. He gets the game plan ready for week 1, and they absolutely dominate as Patrick Mahomes is undefeated in his week 1 performances throughout his entire career. So therefore, I'm anticipating Patrick Mahomes even in the absence of Travis Kelce to ball out. Moving on, let's talk about Josh Allen, our number 4. Josh Allen has a tough matchup. That is a given. But even in the face of a difficult matchup, Josh Allen last season presented high upside for fantasy purposes. Against the New York Jets, they played them twice, week 9 and week 14. In the first game, 24.8 fantasy points. In the second game, 20.58 fantasy points. Just to put it into perspective, in those 2 games combined, Josh Allen only had 352 passing yards and 1 passing touchdown. He was 34 of 61 passing with a 55.75% passing completion percentage. The main statistics that he gathered was on the ground. In those 2 contests, combined for 19 rushing attempts, over 130 rushing yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns, which was the biggest difference maker. If in fact Josh Allen is going to find himself struggle, of course the rushing game will be able to bail him out. But the fact of the matter was that in those 2 contests, he was dealing with that elbow injury. Of course, he sustained that elbow injury against the New York Jets in week 9 of last season. Prior to it, was one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy football, averaging over 26 fantasy points per game. We're hoping he's going to get back to that trend healthy and ready to go for week 1. All right, moving on to our number 5, we have Justin Fields. Justin Fields takes on a division rival in the Green Bay Packers. Last season, in the 2 games in which he took them on, week 2, 70 passing yards, an interception, and 8.8 fantasy points. All of his overall contributions were on the ground. Now, as we go ahead and progress throughout the season, like we've mentioned all offseason, for weeks 5 through 17, Justin Fields was a completely different quarterback, averaging 23.49 fantasy points per game. Throughout that span of time, he did take on the Green Bay Packers. Additionally, in week 13, in that game, 254 passing yards, had himself 71 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 19.26 fantasy points per game. Even though he turned over the ball twice in terms of interceptions, there is a high likelihood that Justin Fields will get back to his high level of production against this defense. I know that their coverage in terms of Jair Alexander is going to make it difficult to find DJ Moore, but there are going to be opportunities to get him the ball in space, which will allow Justin Fields to be able to, kind of dish it out to all of his receiving options. Additionally, with the rushing upside that he presents every single week, that overall statistical base that he's going to produce is just so much higher than other quarterbacks in comparison. I mean, his current underdog number is 59.5 rushing yards, higher or lower. The expectation is if he can find himself 6 or more fantasy points from rushing statistics alone, we're going to be in a pretty good spot with Justin Fields going into week 1. Moving on to Justin Herbert. Now, we've mentioned this matchup all week long. The Los Angeles Chargers taking on the Miami Dolphins have the second highest total implicated points going into week 1. Therefore, this should be a shootout. And if that's absolutely going to be the case, we're talking about Justin Herbert, who last season in week 14 against the Miami Dolphins, 367 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 19.48 fantasy points in a game in which he was 39 of 51 passing with a 76.47% passing completion percentage. Now, we know that Vic Fangio has come in and he's going to be the defensive coordinator of the Miami Dolphins this season. The last time Justin Herbert took on Vic Fangio as a defensive coordinator, it was in 2020 and 2021, as Vic Fangio was the head coach and defensive kind of play caller of the Denver Broncos throughout that span of time. In those games, Justin Herbert averaged 268 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 21 rushing yards, and 18.84 fantasy points per game. Throughout those 4 games in which he took on Vic Fangio and the Denver Broncos defense, he averaged a 66.22% passing completion percentage. I'm expecting Justin Herbert in a high-scoring matchup with a healthy offensive line, receiving core, to dominate. Our number 7 for this week is Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow, of course, is coming off the calf injury, and there's going to be questions as to whether or not he's going to be able to run away from guys like Myles Garrett. Hopefully, Orlando Brown at the left tackle position is going to be able to kind of hold him up. But we all know that Joe Burrow, throughout his entire career, has not really had a stable offensive line, and that has purely forced him to have to throw the ball very quickly. Amongst all quarterbacks last season, in terms of dropbacks that led to passing attempts that were within 2.5 seconds of the snap, Joe Burrow was number 2, only behind Tom Brady within that category. Specifically, Joe Burrow, 392 of his 606 passing attempts last season were within 2.5 seconds of the initial snap. That is a ridiculous statistic. He is going to get the ball out of his hands quickly. He has learned to do so throughout his career, and he's only getting better at it. Now, last season, he did take on his division rivals in the Cleveland Browns twice. In those 2 games, was able to produce a minimum of 230 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns in each of those contests. Unfortunately, some of those games had some turnovers, and the Cleveland Browns truly do play the Cincinnati Bengals tough. In fact, the Cincinnati Bengals are 1-5 against the Cleveland Browns since 2020. Just putting that into perspective. Luckily, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, we will have Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both healthy. Unfortunately, Joe Burrow last season did not have that for both of those games against the Cleveland Browns. With both those guys ready to go, this should be a fantastic matchup for Joey Burrow. Moving on, we have our number 8 for this week, Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence takes on another division rival, Indianapolis Colts. Last season, in the 2 games in which he took them on, 18.5 fantasy points, 24.9. In those 2 contests, he was extremely efficient. I mean, quite literally was 45 of 52 passing, an 86.54% passing completion percentage. And that was against a Colts defense that had Isaiah Rodgers and Stephon Gilmore as their primary starting cornerbacks. Like I mentioned yesterday in the wide receiver video, Stephon Gilmore, Isaiah Rodgers, amongst all cornerbacks in terms of coverage last season, according to Pro Football Focus, those were 2 of the top 10 highest graded cornerbacks in terms of coverage in 2022. The fact that those guys are gone, you're replacing it with Flowers and a rookie by the name of Brents, leads me to believe that Trevor Lawrence is going to find himself a lot of success, especially with the addition of someone like Calvin Ridley in this offense. In the 2 games in which he took on the Indianapolis Colts last season, 235 and 2 touchdowns in the first game. In the second game, 165 through the air, 1 touchdown, but also had himself 23 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns in that contest. I'm expecting a lot of success from Trevor Lawrence. Our number 9 for this week is Geno Smith. Geno Smith takes on a division rival as well, the Los Angeles Rams. Last season in the 2 contests that he took them on, 22.98 and 13.62. Unfortunately, in the second game in week 18, struggled heavily, turned over the ball twice. This team ran the ball with Kenneth Walker 29 times in that overall contest. And even Geno Smith got himself a lot of utilization on the ground with 4 rushing attempts and 51 rushing yards. We know that the rushing upside of Geno Smith is always going to be present, which will continue to keep him relevant, even if he struggles at times with turnovers. But last season in the contest against the Los Angeles Rams was 47 of 70 passing, which is a 67% passing completion percentage. If you guys remember me talking about Geno Smith this offseason, amongst all quarterbacks in 2022, he had the highest passing completion percentage, yet he still struggled against the Los Angeles Rams last season. Having Jalen Ramsey gone now is only going to make it easier. We saw that Jackson Smith-Njigba was practicing on Monday. If in fact he's a surprise start, Geno Smith continues to elevate his overall potential upside. Going on to number 10, we have Tua Tagovailoa. So here's the thing about Tua. Again, this matchup is going to be a higher scoring event. The last time Tua Tagovailoa took on the Los Angeles Chargers, week 14 of last year, was in my opinion the worst game of his career. Started 0 for 11 passing, finished the game 10 for 28 passing with a 35.71% passing completion percentage. Had himself still 145 passing yards and a passing touchdown thanks to a 70-yard bomb down the sideline from Tyreek Hill. But when you have players like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle within a lineup, you absolutely have the home run hitters. So all you have to do is get the ball into their hands and allow them to make plays after the catch. Tua last season, in the games in which he was healthy and ready to go, including even this game in which he took on the Los Angeles Chargers last season, he still averaged 20.67 fantasy points per game. Even if you remove the game against the Baltimore Ravens, in which Tua Tagovailoa had over 450 passing yards and 6 passing touchdowns in that contest, he still averaged 18.65 fantasy points per game while healthy, averaging 274 passing yards and 1.89 passing touchdowns per game. I'm expecting Tua to get back to success, healthy and ready to go. Our number 11 for this week, to close out the D tier for today's episode, is Kirk Cousins. As of Underdog Fantasy today, his current number in terms of total passing yards, going higher or lower, is 260.5 passing yards. The reason why I wanted to bring that to light primarily has to do with the fact that in the last 3 games that Kevin O'Connell has been the offensive coordinator up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense and Todd Bowles leading the direction, there has been a lot of success from Rams quarterbacks. Again, Kevin O'Connell used to be the former offensive coordinator of the Rams from 2020 through 2021. In the 3 games in which they took on Todd Bowles and the Tampa Bay defense, both Stafford and Goff in those contests were each able to surpass 340 passing yards minimum. They aired it out and they absolutely dominated against the defense that really does not give up much on the ground. Last season, when TJ Hawkinson was traded for and brought into the organization, from weeks 9 through the playoffs, Kirk Cousins was averaging 280 passing yards per game, 1.9 passing touchdowns per game, and 18.2 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting him to blow out this number of 260.5 passing yards. Moving on, let's talk about Deshaun Watson as our number 12, closing out the top 12 of the conversation. Deshaun Watson takes on the Cincinnati Bengals. Like I mentioned earlier in regards to Joe Burrow, the Cleveland Browns since 2020 are 5-1 against the Cincinnati Bengals. There has just been a consistent level of success from Kevin Stefanski, his play calling against this defense and being able to light them up early in the season, especially in the first matchup in which these two teams take each other on. The game plan is going to be there. And now that we have Deshaun Watson with a full offseason, building rapport with these receivers, whether it is Amari Cooper, David Njoku, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Elijah Moore, Nick Chubb, there is going to be a heightened level of success in comparison to what we were able to witness from Deshaun Watson late last season, and especially against the Cincinnati Bengals in week 14 of last year. Didn't really find much success considering he wasn't as efficient as we've seen him be in the past. Our number 13 for this week is Dak Prescott. Moving into the F tier, Dak Prescott takes on the New York Giants. Again, last season in week 12, took them on 261 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Unfortunately, turned over the ball twice, had himself 2 interceptions, which decreased his overall fantasy contribution to 14.84 fantasy points within that given contest. But throughout that span of time, as soon as Dak Prescott returned from injury from weeks 7 through 18 of the 2022 fantasy football season, Dak Prescott was averaging 248 passing yards, 2.09 passing touchdowns, and 17.65 fantasy points per game. Now that you have no Ezekiel Elliott in the lineup, in my opinion, there is a heightened level of potential in which Dak Prescott can be utilized near the red zone goal line to be a rushing prospect, especially considering how many years kind of away he is from that ankle injury. If we see Dak Prescott of old, talking about 2016 through 2018, where he was scoring about 6 rushing touchdowns a season, if we see that potential upside continue to kind of present itself in these upcoming contests, especially going up against the defense that has 2 starting rookie cornerbacks, you insert someone like Brandon Cooks into this lineup, there should be a high level of success, not only on the ground, but through the air for the Dallas Cowboys going into week 1. Our number 14 is Daniel Jones. On the other side of this matchup, of course, the New York Giants, their offense, they're going to try to, of course, bring in all these new pieces with guys like Darren Waller, Paris Campbell, Jalen Hyatt, and elevate their entire offense. If that's going to be the case, we will certainly see far more fantasy point contributions from Daniel Jones in comparison to last year. Daniel Jones in the 2 matchups against the Dallas Cowboys, 196 passing yards, 228 passing yards, only 1 passing touchdown in those 2 contests. But the reason why he was still able to stay relevant is because of his rushing totals in those 2 games. Was able to get himself 12 rushing attempts for 93 rushing yards. So for the purposes of fantasy points, that's about a passing touchdown per game just off rushing statistics alone, which continues to level out his overall play. Hopefully, the pieces that they've brought in and, of course, the upgrades they've made to their offensive line only help Daniel Jones, because against the Dallas Cowboys last season was 41 of 72 passing. Now the Dallas Cowboys bring in someone like Stephon Gilmore. It's going to be more difficult, but I do expect Daniel Jones to have the rushing upside, which will continue to keep him relevant for fantasy purposes. Let's move on to number 15. We have Jared Goff. Jared Goff, Thursday Night Football tomorrow against the Kansas City Chiefs. The weather should be great, and so should Jared Goff. Due to the absence of Chris Jones, there should be less pressure between the A and B gaps, and if that's going to be the case, I mean, in terms of the overall protection scheme of the offensive line, all offseason they have prepared to shift the protections towards Chris Jones and to try to double team him. The fact that he is not going to be present is only going to help protect Jared Goff even more within this offense. Like we've seen already this week, the expectation in terms of total points leads us to believe that the Kansas City Chiefs and the Detroit Lions game should be the highest scoring event of the week. Therefore, Jared Goff should be quite relevant for fantasy purposes. The only reason he's down here at number 15 is because his rushing upside isn't as high as these other prospects. Now, speaking of rushing upside, let's talk about the final quarterback of today's episode. It is Anthony Richardson. Like I've said all off season, if we have seen guys like Marcus Mariota and Taysom Hill still be fantasy relevant despite the fact that they have not been efficient in the passing game, we can absolutely trust Anthony Richardson in week 1 against the Jacksonville Jaguars to be fantasy relevant, because the difference between what we saw from guys like Taysom Hill, Marcus Mariota in seasons past in comparison to what Anthony Richardson has, which is a ridiculous offensive line, and Shane Steichen. Shane Steichen, the former offensive coordinator of the Philadelphia Eagles, helped Jalen Hurts get to that level of all those designed runs and elevating his game specifically down in the red zone to being one of the most successful rushers in the National Football League, whether it's a running back or a quarterback. We're hoping he's going to elevate Anthony Richardson in year 1. Playing against Jacksonville in week 1 is definitely going to be difficult, but they're at home, so hopefully he's comfortable for the week 1 matchup on hand. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. If you have not yet already, again, subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season for the singular purpose of trying to help you capture a fantasy football championship. For those of you who want more extensive rankings besides my top 36 running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, and tight ends, be sure to go ahead and travel down to the description of the video. You can either check out the Patreon, in which you can find those services there in regards to all my rankings, half PPR, full PPR, flex, all those positions, or like I mentioned earlier, you can travel down to the description, head on over to Underdog Fantasy, sign up using code Andrew, and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. You'll get my rankings every single Sunday morning from my email to yours, which will have all the rankings, every position by tier, half PPR, full PPR, to give you guys as many advantages as you can get going into the 2023 season. So take advantage of the opportunity. And until tomorrow, which we'll be talking about the tight end position, I'll see you guys. Peace.